Ya Ali Madad to all of you, and welcome to Dr. Hassan's lecture tonight, Monday, July 27, 2020. In this session, Dr. Hassam will continue with part 2 of the subject entitled Enhancing the Intellect. We'll begin with a Ginan recitation by Yasmin Juma.
जी हो रे पियासी पिया तेरे दर्शन की आशा पिया मोरे मन की हूँ रे प्यासी आश तोरी तू चिंता मोरी खिदमत खास हवास तोरी रूठा साजन क्यों फिरो जी दीदारी होवे सो ऐसा चाहे साहेब जी को छोड़ कर और खूना दिया वे दीदारी होवे सो दिल बांधे नीता का नेहादरे एक मन हो कर नाम लेवे पिया को दर्शन सो करे जी।
Thank you, Yasmin. That was beautiful. Dr. Hassam, Yali Madad.
Mulani Madad.
Okay, so we are ready to start.
To start, thank you very much. Yali Madad, everyone. Welcome again to part 2 of the session Enhancing the Intellect. As I always like to do is just add one or two remarks and observation excuse me, about our wonderful tradition of Ginans, as our beloved Imam calls it. And what I would like to say that from the part 1, if you have at least come to the understanding that it is the intellect, it is the akal, that which keeps the human being, at least from the perspective of our tariqah, as I always like to add in the beginning of my session, my presentations to the best of my ability and with Mola's blessings is intended to add clarity, intended to articulate aspects of our practice. It is intended to ensure that we are on that path, the path which our beloved Imam traces for us, teaches us, and wants us to walk upon. So, as I said, if you have followed from part one of the first part of enhancing the intellect, then you should have come at least to that realization that it is the akal which keeps the mu'min, the murid, on the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim and prevents him from going astray. So, having said that, it is important to link that with our traditions of Ginans, because, as you well know, that is a tradition along with our other traditions, excuse me, along with our other traditions of Qasidas and Mankabat and Masnavis and the forms of devotional and knowledge literature that we have. You know, they offer, if I can put it into a framework, when you look at the knowledge in the Ginans, and remember, it's not just singing, it is not just love and devotion, which is enormously important. But when you look at the Ginans, and even when you look at the Qasidas, when you look at other forms of devotional and loving literature we have in our tariqah, you take them all together and you look at what a beautiful gift our beloved Imam has given us, in which we have to go in and see how we can unpack it so we can make it a part of our consciousness, of our mind, of our thinking, of our way of life. Because this literature, if I can use that word, it's more than just a literature, but these compositions, these manifestations, they are, if you like, knowledge infused with love. Think about this. We say ishq and akal is knowledge. Knowledge of pure being that our holy peers and dais have given us. But this knowledge is infused with love. And in that sense of the term, when you look at the framework within which we understand our Ginan to the extent that our intellect allows us, you find that there is metaphysical knowledge, there is theological knowledge, there is spiritual wisdom, which is in fact what the word Ginan means. There is cosmological knowledge, there is the knowledge of history, meta-history. There is knowledge about the human spirit and the human soul. And there is knowledge about history of the past that gives us the link, how Ismaili Satpant Garam has evolved over history. And it tells us in that history who the Imams of the past were, what were their teachings, what did they say to us, how did we come to be where we are today. All of these are reflected in the thousands and thousands and thousands of verses that are in the corpus of the Ginans that are yet to be explored, researched, understood, and implemented. The whole purpose of knowledge that our holy peers have given us by the authority of the Imam is so that that knowledge should be applied, should be put into practice. As a result of which, we have to commit ourselves to understand what that understanding is. So, in thinking about that, think about the intellect. And I shall have a lot more to say about it today. But the perspective that we see that our holy peers have given us in the holy Ginans is based on the concept of mono-reality. It is based on the concept of oneness. It is based on the concept of Tawheed. And we must understand the metaphysical ramifications of that, the spiritual and the material understanding of that. Because that is knowledge coming from Noor. Ginan bolo nite Noore Bariya. It is inundated. It is flooded with Noor. Now, it is not an easy task. But please remember, it is the wish and the desire of our beloved Imam that we must maintain this tradition for generations and generations yet to be born. And I certainly encourage the Jamaat and members who participate that allow yourself to listen to Ginans in many different ways. Now, there are many different sites that I see on YouTube about Ginan. There are not that many, but certainly there are. And there are many individuals as well as groups who have, out of their own ways and understanding, recited and basically made these Ginans available out of their love and affection, as an expression of the love and affection for the Ginanic literature. And in submission and in the notion of participation that the Jamaat would enjoy them. And there are some absolutely excellent reciters. And I have to say to you, I'm not necessarily leaning to any one particular site, but one of the sites that has really inspired me because I've seen a very large number of younger people getting into Ginans, expressing their love and affection through Ginans and Qasidas. And this site where many young people participate into is certainly a site to be explored. That is the site of the Ginan Guru, which I had the opportunity to say a few words, I think, into that third episode. So there are many others. I'm not saying to you this is the only one. Every site has their own perspective, their own way of rendering that the Ginans, and they're all wonderfully impacting the soul, the heart. And that is what you will see most of all in our Qasidas and in our Ginans. What will you see? You will see amazing knowledge, but infused with love. And this concept of love and knowledge, intellect and divine love, are infused together. It is so wonderful to think that we have access to this kind of experience, because it's truly intended to give the soul, the spirit, in the end, the heart, the experience. What experience? The experience of liberation. Ginans give us the knowledge that leads into freedom and liberation of the soul. Remember, there is this saying in other tradition, they say, the truth shall set you free. Indeed, it is the truth that will set us free. And if it is the truth that sets us free, then there has to be a source of truth. And our holy peers have very clearly asserted, by the authority of our beloved Imams, that hakikat, that truth, is reflected in the knowledge of truth, the path of truth, the understanding of truth, the truth that removes all doubt, the truth that brings light into our heart, our eyes, our intellect, our understanding. And that hakikat and that truth is encompassed, it is infused in the Ghanaic tradition, in the Qasidas, in the Manqabat, in the Masnavis, and in the poetic forms of expression that are in our tradition, and in particular the ones that have been validated by the Imams of the past and certainly the Imam of the time. So we are so amazingly fortunate that we are part of a faith. We are part of a tariqah in Islam that recognizes the absolute, incontrovertible, non-negotiable concept of how the intellect forms an integral part of our tariqah. And you know very well, right from the time, just to give you a point, that when the Aga Khan University was introduced and was founded, and in that foundational time, our beloved Imam said, it is the divine intellect that informs. It is the divine intellect that transcends but informs the human intellect. A connection between the divine and the human, the divine intellect and the human intellect. So bear this point in mind, because today, hopefully, we'll come to the crux of it. And when I look at the scope, just to take a bit of a tangent here, when I look at the scope of this subject, it is so incredibly vast. But we can continue saying that, and maybe in some other way we can bring other perspectives down the road. But I rely on you to tell me by your messages and your chat and your feedback whether you like more of this. But for today, let us focus on that part 2, whereby we continue exploring the spiritual aspect of what this intellect means, and eventually how this intellect is objectified, how it is used in the process of our daily life, decision-making, and other ways in which this intellect permeates our whole existence. So I was saying to you that in that speech at the Aga Khan University, our beloved Imam very clearly stated the divine intellect transcends and informs the human intellect. Who is the divine intellect for us? So that there is no confusion. The divine intellect is nothing but the nur of the Imam. In our tariqah, we see that as the nur. Remember, it's our tariqah. I'm not speaking about others. And if others need to see it in their own reflection, we perfectly are comfortable with it. What we are saying is, it is our beloved Imam speaking in relation to this concept. And there is no ambiguity to that, because our beloved Imam has said to us, and he has mentioned it in many different places, and I can only, for the perspective of our talk today, simply paraphrase and to say that the whole university, the Aga Khan University that was founded by our beloved Imam, was itself a reflection of the continuation of the principle and foundation of expressing the intellect. And as our Imam have said, right from the time of Hazrat Ali. And he said since the time of Hazrat Ali, the interpretation of our faith has been that the intellect of the human being should be accessible, that the intellect should be entitled to its full dimension, the Imam says. Now, are we in a position to comprehend this statement that the intellect should be entitled to its full dimension? So how many dimensions has the intellect has? If we speak about, as an example, so that we are on the same page, because you know, what I have in my mind may not be what you have in your mind, understandably so. But to say that what could be the full dimension of the intellect, and I can assure you that I'm very tempted to use other forms of technical language, metaphysical language, to express that, because it is something that we cannot always express it simply with the level of the mind. We have to go beyond that. But language is limited to the construct of the mind, and therefore we have difficulty going beyond the notion of logic and rationality, which basically sometimes limits us to understand what is beyond that. But let's not worry about the technicalities. Let's see whether we can use even our intuitive sense. Aha, that's an important one. Our intuitive sense that actually comes from the source of the intellect. And we call that spiritual, we call that actually intellectual intuition. And where does intellectual intuition come from? Maybe I'll have time to say something about it. But let's stay focused on the goal of the intellect in our tariqah, in Islam. The goal of the intellect in our tariqah, and remember, it is only the Imam of the time who can give meaning and interpretation of what our practices are related to and connected to. In this case, if it is the notion of the intellect, then the Imam of the time is abundantly clear where he says that the intellect of the human being should be entitled to its full dimension. Meaning that it should enable the human being's mind to gain a better understanding and a more complete understanding of faith. So look at here the first connection. The Imam categorically mentions the whole purpose of this. You know, at least if you look at it from a very practical way, which is what our Imam says, that the access the mind should have on the basis of understanding the faith is an intellectual activity. So that the human mind gains a better and a complete understanding of one's faith. On top of that, our Imam says that the intellect cannot be constrained. It cannot be constrained on that interpretation of the faith. Because he says, remember that the intellect of the human being is changing in society. It's changing in its knowledge. And it's changing in the way of how the human being understands the world in which he lives. And then our beloved Imam says very clear that if you constrain, if you limit that intellect, then you obviously stop and you constrain and you put a barrier in the ability to understand and partake and fulfill and gain fulfillment from the benefit of the faith, which our faith is open to it. Because in the context of our faith, it is the intellect that enables the human being to achieve this understanding and this multiple interpretation, but also to position ourselves in society in which the Imam tells us. And he has said to us that Islam is for the eternal. That's a statement from the Imam. If Islam is for the eternal, then what is the one element that is within us that will go on generations after generation in the practice of our faith? And that is the intellect. That is the intellect. And it is indeed, our beloved Imam says to us, it is indeed our belief and our conviction. So, if you limit the intellect of the human being, our beloved Imam explains to us, you create a gap. You create a gap between man's comprehension of the faith in a particular given time, in a particular period of history, and that gap that the Imam speaks about is not something that is allowed in our tariqah. You cannot create that gap. In fact, some words Imam have used are very strong. He says that that cannot be tolerated or allowed. And that is the reason why in our tariqah of Islam, for so many decades, it has been at the forefront of development of the human being's intellect. And very nicely, our beloved Imam has given some example. He said, remember Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was an amazing philosopher, scientist of the 11th century. And it is worth examining his works. They are not sometimes easy to penetrate, but if one takes some time, and maybe here and there, whenever the opportunity arises, I may bring out some of the teachings of Ibn Sina, and it is amazing because the Imam brings it up here. He said Ibn Sina but he said it is one, but just one example. And then he speaks about the Azhar. What happened during the Fatimid period? What happened at Al-Azhar University? Imam said it's another example, but just one example only. So we are not stuck with Ibn Sina. We are not stuck with Al-Azhar. And then further than that, the Imam says, don't forget Kairwan. Don't forget Kairwan. The point of all of this, the Imam is pointing us to these various centers of learning that existed in the past and in our history. And all of these centers that were infused with the teachings of Hazrat Ali alayhi salam, the principle of the intellect, the Imam said this was a continuation of the tradition of enhancing the human intellect. The title of my lecture, Enhancing the Intellect, was taken from this statement that Imam made. It's a continuation of the tradition of enhancing the intellect of the human being, of enabling the intellect of the human being to bear on the interpretation of our faith, of our tariqah at any given time in history. And our beloved Imam says the Aga Khan University is an expression of that continuation. And we must reaffirm our conviction to the notion of the intellect to the point that it must never be divorced from the faith and must never be constrained in any time, because that cannot be allowed in our tariqah. Now, these were some of the powerful explanation and directive our beloved Imam gave about the notion of the intellect. you can see when our beloved Imam spent so much time into this explanation, there is a reason. There is a reason. And we must, in our own way, really understand how we continually and continuously enrich our intellect. And that is my objective in continuing today in this part 2. So, I have to tell you something nice, that last week when I mentioned to you a couple of things in the beginning, and I began by saying the first thing created by God was the intellect. That is a prophetic saying. And one of the viewers sent me back a text message. Many of you did actually, very nice ones, and all were quoting. But this one here said something very interesting and very nicely. And I think she lives in Toronto. Her name is Naila. And I'm saying her because I'm acknowledging what she says. She said, how much more obvious can it be that if he is the divine intellect and the first thing that it created was the intellect, well, how obvious is that? That is totally obvious, and that is so nice. That, and a very nice connection to make logically to say, what else but the divine intellect can create? Obviously, the first thing it created was the intellect. So I said, Naila, thank you for that comment. And then I mentioned that God did not distribute to his servant anything more than to be esteemed an intelligence, is what Hazrat Ali said. And remember the Quranic saying that God is the nur of the heavens and the earth. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. So, let me get straight into an aspect while we are talking about this notion, and we'll come back to some practical aspects, okay? And how can we continue to understand this whole gift and, if you like, the divinity of what the intellect is? And I say the word divinity because truly the intelligence is a divine gift. Intelligence is a divine gift. And the intellect itself is divine and only human to the extent that the human being participates in it. I know sometimes the statements are a bit ambiguous, but as I said, some of the metaphysical things are difficult to say in very simple language without losing the complete meaning of it. So let me repeat that. The intellect itself is divine. Because remember, the first thing created was the intellect. From whom? The divine intellect. So the intellect itself is divine. And only human to the extent that the human being participates in it. It is light as well as reason. It is light as well as vision and reason and logic. I'll come to it in a second. But try to understand, first of all, the spiritual context of the intellect. Look, without going through the intricacies of the details, which could be done, let me say this to you. When you look at the intellect in its origin point, the intellect itself is the spirit. When all is said and done, the intellect itself is the spirit. Don't separate them. Don't separate them. They only appear separate to the extent that we participate in it because of our unrealized state. But the intellect and the spirit are one. As I've said before, it's like you look at a coin. There is that side and there is that side. So you say, well, which side of the coin is the coin? Both sides are the coin. You can't say one side is the coin and one side is not. They are one. The intellect and spirit are one. The only thing is, when the spirit or the soul enters the human body, obviously it has to, because it is using this human body as a vehicle of expression into the material world. And as I've sought to explain in one of my previous talks, when it enters the body, what happens to this spirit? It becomes objectified, meaning it begins to identify itself with the material body. And the material body is itself an expression of the spirit, but in a material form. But that pure spirit, our pure being, which is pure being actually, the word being is a bit difficult, it's a capital B-E-E-I-N-G, means, in a sense, what we are truly spiritually, what we are truly, the self-luminous self, the self-luminous self, meaning that divine light that is in us, it is the spirit. It is what we say the soul. It manifests itself in what we conceptualize as the intellect. Let me put it to you another way. The permanent presence. Try to understand this statement, okay? The permanent presence of the divine, the permanent presence of the divine manifestation in the human microcosm is the intellect. Let me rephrase that in a simpler way. Let me rephrase the concept. The intellect is the permanent presence of the divine manifestation in the human microcosm. Now you could say human being for simplicity's sake, but I use the word human microcosm because a human being is much more than that. It's much more than that. Now let me just continue a bit forward and then we'll see whether we can add more explanation. But if I was simply to say in one statement, and I repeat this because it is so important, the presence of divine manifestation in the human microcosm is the intellect, or the intellect is the presence of the divine in the human microcosm. Remember what I said to you in part 1 of the lecture, when I quoted an ayat of the Quran, that He created the human being and He breathed into him His spirit. That is the intellect. Are you following me? That is the intellect. I created him and I breathed into him my spirit. That is the intellect as the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm. Now, you can imagine how exalted that is. How exalted that is. So take a minute or so to process that, and let me just continue with 1 or 2 points. So, the intellect is not the mind. Remember this, in that technical sense. The intellect is not the mind, nor is it reason per se. It is not the mind, it is not the reason, which is in fact the reflection of the intellect upon the human plane. But it is the root and it is the center of consciousness, and the soul. You probably are trying to put these pieces together, but it's not difficult. Because if you allow yourself to understand this, that we as human beings are composed of two specific realities. To put it very simply, we are the body-mind part, that's one reality. And then the other reality is our spirit, our soul. So we are soul in the body-mind complex. If you take away that soul, the body-mind complex just becomes nil and void. So the soul, which is the self-luminous self, the soul, the spirit, the Ruh, the Atma, which is the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm, is the intellect. That's why the intellect is a divine gift. The intellect is divine, is itself divine, because it came from the, remember the sentence? The divine intellect. Never ever forget this connection. Because if you forget that connection, it's like basically cutting yourself off from the source. That's why our tariqah upholds the sacred nature of what this intellect is. I'm coming to some more explanation in a second, but I just want to state this, that the spiritual principle, the principle at the level of the spirit. And remember, the spirit is by the command of God. The spirit is by the command of God. If I can paraphrase the verse of the Quran, I don't have it here, but it says that, O Muhammad, they will ask you concerning the spirit. And when they ask you concerning the spirit, tell them the spirit is by the command of God. The spirit is by the command of my Lord. And the knowledge which we have given you about it is very little, and only to some. It's a knowledge that's been guarded, sacredly guarded. It's not there for everyone. This is at least one way to look at that particular verse of the Quran. So the spiritual principle, and we use sometimes a technical term called the metacosmic principle, which is a mouthful, but a very nice term. The metacosmic principle, which is the intellect. Now, why is that word important? Because remember, the word cosmic refers to the material creation. When we use the word cosmic in this theological, philosophical sense, cosmic normally refers to the physical manifestation of creation, to whichever extent you want to see it. But the metacosmic, going beyond the cosmic principle, we are referring to the spiritual principle or the spiritual creation, if you like. So the intellect is part of that metacosmic principle. It goes beyond the material principle. Why do I say that? Simply to emphasize and to give the understanding that it is the source. It is the source within which the human being receives spiritual understanding, which basically creates the link, the connection, the bond between the human being, the cosmos, and of course the metacosmic reality. How can I put that in simple terms? It's only through the intellect you will eventually come to realize the absolute oneness of the divine, which we call Tawheed. It is only through the intellect we will come to realize what is the purpose of why this whole universe and cosmos was created, and why we were created into this cosmos, and what is our eventual objective within the scheme of creation. Remember the hadith that I spoke about, the metacosmic purpose of creation, the metacosmic purpose of manifestation was that Hadith al-Qudusi says, I was a hidden treasure. I wanted to be known, so I brought mankind into existence so they could gain knowledge about me. Knowledge about whom? Knowledge about the divine intellect. Knowledge about the Nur. To gain that through the principle of the intellect in its spiritual manifestation, in its spiritual form, in its spiritual way. Now remember that this reality, this metacosmic principle of the intellect, though it is spiritually bounded without a shadow of doubt, but it also has a material component. How so? Like I said, I don't want to delve into this aspect too deeply because, as I mentioned in part 1, to understand the whole reality of how the mind actually functions is a separate presentation. It's too long to do it here, otherwise we'll be all over the place. But simply to say and repeat this, that Atma, that spirit, that soul, when it manifests itself physically, meaning it enters the body-mind complex, so it enters the level of the mind. What happens at the level of the mind? The mind becomes alive because of the light of the intellect or the soul. That light reflected on the mind gives the mind its ability to know. At what level? At the ability to know at the level of reason, at the level of logic, at the level of analysis. This is what the mind does best. But once the mind achieves that ability in its various multifarious ways, it, when enlightened, is able to achieve back to unity. So to put it simply, the intellect creates synthesis, unity, and the mind creates analysis or diversity. So diversity going back into unity, or if you like, unity express itself in diversity through the mind. And that is so fundamental to understand, because if we fail to understand that, we will confuse the mind with the intellect. And we will think the mind is actually the intellect in that technical sense. What I mean by that is, you cannot say that your mind is the soul. Your mind is not the soul. But what is the mind then? Very simply, the mind is simply a reflection of that soul at the level of the body, at the level of the material realm and the world. It is through the mind, that the soul, the intellect, expresses itself in the material world for the purpose of its material functions. And there are many different layers that allows us to do that, which I'm not going into it. As I said, it's pretty detailed. Our Gnans are amazing because our holy peers have not left any part of knowledge unexplored. At some point in time, inshallah, we shall explore the deeper spiritual physiology of the human being and see how we are constructed and constituted. But for today, simply to say, the mind is not the soul. That is like saying that the intellect, the spirit, the soul, which actually brings that light into the mind reflects that light in the material sense and utilizes the mind becomes the basis that a human being has as a faculty, if you like, to investigate, understand, participate, analyze, decompose what is in the material realm to understand. Do you see one of the things the mind does best is analysis and also to follow patterns? Let's come to that just in a little bit. But let me continue a little bit more on the notion of the intellect as expressed to us by our beloved Imam in many different ways. And one of the ideas, one of the concepts that has been so amazing, and we must be grateful in prostration. We must be grateful to our beloved Imam. We must take every breath of ours, every breath, to express our shukrana to Hazar Imam, to express our gratitude to our beloved Imam, to bring us, to enlighten us, to have brought His light into our heart and into our soul, to make us understand how amazingly the intellect is this part of our tariqah, which is so unique that I feel it important to mention that it is a uniqueness of our tariqah. Of course, Islam as a faith expresses that too in the totality of the faith. But within the faith of Islam, our tariqah has very specifically, concentratedly, and in a very focused manner given importance to this intellect, infused with love, infused with iman, the practice of the faith. But you see, the Imam, our beloved Imam, makes it holistic for us. It's a total concept. It's not separated. And what our beloved Imam says? Our beloved Imam has said to us, first of all, remember and never forget, we are living in a world of information. And therefore education is uppermost in what our beloved Imam says to us. It doesn't matter whether you are 7-year-old, I should even say 7 months old, because remember our beloved Imam spoke about what happens in the womb of a mother. Learning begins in the womb. So whether you are 7 months, 7-year, or 77-year-old, education is a continuous process. Continuing education. Look, when our beloved Imam says this to the Jamaat, it means something that you have to apply. And that means you have to find the various ways that exist today in our society to continue learning. And you know, it's not like you necessarily think that, well, you have to go back to school and you have to look at this book and you have to, sometimes people think you have to re-engage yourself into that kind of activity. Of course, it would be nice to do that, even at the age of 77. But you know what? There is so much knowledge when you look at various knowledge networks in YouTube, in the internet, on the TV, when you look at various sites that gives you documentaries about the world, about the universe, about this, about that, about the human being, about health. It's fascinating. Don't lose time simply watching entertainment, which is important also, very important. But balance it out. Say to yourself, let me spend a few minutes. Let me spend a few minutes enlightening myself with new knowledge. And that is what our beloved Imam said. There is new knowledge. Society is changing at every moment. And we must apply our intellect, not constrain it. But the application depends on this enlightenment that our faith offers us. So let us see what it says. Our beloved Imam has explained to us in no uncertain terms that our tariqah, as I mentioned a moment ago, places education on a very, very high place. So education and intellect are placed on a very high level of importance. Okay? And if education and the intellect is placed on a very high level of importance, you will be amazed why the Imam says that. You remember, he says, we trust in the intellect. Why? Imagine this. We trust in the intellect. Why? Because it is what makes the human being, the man and woman, his highest, his greatest creation. And the Imam repeats that by saying, what makes the greatest creation different from others? What is that? What is it? And our beloved Imam replies, the intellect. Nothing else. Nothing else. Now, doesn't that reinforce the point, just to take this last point? If it is the intellect that makes the human being his greatest creation, nothing else, it is the intellect. Doesn't that reinforces the fact that there is nothing higher than the spirit? Because I created him and I have breathed my spirit into him. Is anything greater than that? If there is, then make it known. But that spirit that he infused in the human being, that makes him the highest, the greatest creation rather, the greatest creation. There's a difference, but it says greatest creation. That greatest creation is because of the intellect. Remember, the Imam said nothing else. It's the intellect. The intellect is the presence, the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm. That's what makes him the greatest in creation, the greatest creation. Now, I have kind of a question to ask all of us. I said, can you think for a moment? Here is Mola Bapa telling us that it is the intellect that makes man the greatest creation. Are you reflecting on this? Are you thinking about this? Look at creation. Look at the universe we live in. Look at the world in which we live in. So think about this way. Here is the world that we live in. I wish I had some graphics to show you, but I'm sure you can find those. Look at the world in which we live in. The Earth. The Earth is part of this solar system. We haven't even conquered the first planet. We are still on Earth. We know more about the moon, and we know other planets through other means, observation and otherwise. But what about beyond the solar system? What is the solar system? We say it's in this galaxy we call the Milky Way, and it is guesstimated that there are 100 billion stars, maybe 200 billion stars. Now remember, the sun is our star in the solar system. And they say there are about 200 billion of those. And then they say there are probably as many galaxies as there are stars in the Milky Way. So even if you take the lower amount and say there are maybe 100 billion galaxies out there, are you following my point of view? Yet Mola Bapa tells us man is Allah's greatest creation. We are the greatest creation because of the intellect. So where do you place intellect then? If we are the greatest creation, obviously it can't be the human body. And the human body is not alone. As I said, it's the body-mind that forms this unit materially. So it can't be the material part, right? I hope you agree with me. If not, it's okay. I would like you to express your view freely. Freely. So if we are the greatest creation, it cannot be just the body-mind complex. Because if you look at creation, the physical creation at least, from what I have explained, then obviously it doesn't make any sense to think we are the greatest creation when we look at creation is so, I'm talking about the universe, the physical cosmos, it's so immense, so huge, that we are not in a position to even comprehend the physical cosmos. So does it stop there? The Holy Quran says there are 7 heavens. What are those heavens? Alame Nasut, which is the physical cosmos. Alme Nasut, Alme Jabarut, Alme Malakut, Alme Hahut, Alme Bahut. What are all those references in Quranic terminology? What about those levels of reality and existence? Yet our beloved Imams, understanding given to us. Remember, when Mola Bapa speaks to us, he is the Noor. So questions about it. And this Noor, because remember, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Allah is the Noor of the heavens and the earth. And I have already mentioned in uncertain terms what that Noor is. A connection between the two. Yet our beloved Imam clearly explains to us that Allah says that man is his greatest creation. Well, no doubt, because when you go back to that hadith, he says, I want it to be known. So I want it to be manifest. So I brought creation into existence, of course, in which he manifested himself. And I created mankind so they can gain knowledge about me. They can learn knowledge about me. Do you see where all this thing is going? From the point of origin. Because the first thing created was the intellect. Allah says that man is his greatest creation. Then the Imam want to emphasize and re-emphasize forcefully. Mola Bapa says to us, what makes that greatest creation different from others? What is it? It is the intellect. Nothing else. Do you see why I say to you that the intellect is the presence of the divine, is the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm? Now, here comes the place to explain the human microcosm. A moment ago, I said to you, we have the physical cosmos, and then we have the spiritual cosmos that we call the metacosmos, if you like. So there is the cosmic reality, the physical cosmos, its reality and understanding, and we have the metacosmic reality, which is the cosmos, or if you like, the spiritual universe, which is beyond the material universe. And when you put that together, only then can you deemly conceive at the level of the mind what creation is all about. Just not the physical creation, but the spiritual creation. So if Allah says, as our beloved Imam confirms, that Allah says that man is his greatest creation, can you imagine at what level we have been positioned in the scheme of the material and spiritual cosmos? So important is this understanding in our tariqah. And our tariqah gives emphasis in the practice that we must come to this realization. The fact we exist in the material cosmos becomes a springboard to allow us to understand, and eventually, with the grace of the Imam, with the blessings of the Imam, with the mercy of Hazar Imam, with Hazar Imam's guidance, to allow our spirit, our ruh, to once again realize its source of origin, which is the source from which we were breathed into, and that is His Nur. This is Allah. Allah. So, a lot more can be said. But remember that everything our beloved Imam is telling us is intended eventually to allow us to understand the human exalted position in creation, which is to understand the place of the intellect that is so to move a bit forward. Don't ever forget this connection. Intellect is the presence of the divine, is the manifestation of God, of the Nur, in the human microcosm. But one point I forgot to mention, it is said in the context of the microcosm and the macrocosm. What is the macrocosm? The macrocosm is everything that is outside the bounds of the material realm. So the whole material cosmos, we can call it the macrocosm, and everything that is beyond this macrocosm, the metacosmic reality, the spiritual realm, but all of them put together, the seven earth and the seven heavens, are all inside the human being. All inside the human being. I repeat, all of them is inside the human being. And therefore that is known as the human microcosm. Macrocosm, microcosm. As it is above, so it is below. What is above is also inside the human being. This is the reason why we go inwards into our spiritual practice. We go inwards. That is the universe with a capital U, and then there is the holoverse, the universe inside of us. Now, how do you explore the macrocosm? How do you explore what is above? How do you explore the physical cosmos with its hundreds of billions of galaxies and so on? We can't even explore the next planet. We don't have the means to get there. Physically speaking, it would take many hundreds of years with the technology we have today to get to the nearest planets. And the nearest star is 4.5 light years. That means if we could travel the speed of light, which is impossible, not physically anyway, because of what Einstein's theory tells us about space contraction and time dilation. What happens? It would take us 4.5 light years to get there. 1 light year is 186,000 miles per second, roughly. Multiply that by 365. Multiply that by 4.5. Then you will get the measurement. We can't do it. So is this whole creation of cosmos to remain a mystery? How is the human intellect ever going to know this? Are you not curious? Are you not somehow wondering and saying, how am I going to know what's up there? Now, when you look at the writings of our dais and some of the expressions our Prophet have said and our peers have said, they said the Imam is the Lord of the 18,000 worlds. Our Peer says his Nur has created these 14 cosmic spheres, and so on and so forth. What are these? The Holy Quran says 7 heaven and 7 earth. Is this all a mystery to remain? And how much do you know physically? I mean, open an astronomy textbook. Ask an astrophysicist, an astronomy professor, ask a scientist who deals with these matters in many different ways. And today, science is pretty well integrated and getting more and more integrated. You are going to be absolutely crazy thinking, my goodness me, of simply understanding the physical cosmos we are in, and that also just at the level of the earth, the terrestrial part of it, is already so amazingly wonderful and also complicated. But what about the subatomic world, meaning the world of matter and beyond? What constitutes matter? What about all the particles that make up matter? And you go deeper and deeper into matter, you are even more flabbergasted. So the two most successful theories in science that we know that are well tested and accepted is Einstein's theory of general relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics. And those two theories is in fact the bedrock. Einstein's general theory of relativity seeks to give us understanding about the universe, about the macrocosmos. And the theory of quantum mechanics seeks to give us understanding about the microcosmos, from the very small to the very large. So there is a big problem there that scientists are trying to solve. The Einstein's theory of general relativity and the theories of quantum mechanics don't speak to each other. They are not compatible. But scientists are trying. They're trying to make this thing possible. And one of the attempts, they call it string theory. I only mention this not to confuse you, but to give you an example. Look what's happening in the material realm. And this big challenge that scientists are trying to bring together to our understanding, from the very small to the very large, and how they can come together. It is a massive challenge. And there is this science, if you like, I mean, by all means not completely codified. They call it quantum gravity because of quantum mechanics and Einstein's general theory of relativity. So the science of quantum gravity seeks to bring this unity and this understanding between all the forces of nature so they work in a cohesive manner. They sometimes call that TOE, the theory of everything, or what will eventually be one theory that speaks about the whole manifestation and construct of science. Look at the human level, at the level of the mind, how the intellect expresses itself. This is what our beloved Imam said to us in the Silver Jubilee, that when a human being makes a discovery, it is Allah who allows the mind to speak, to look through that small window that He has opened. And then we look at that small discovery. But you see, at the level of the human mind, what do? I have made that discovery. I deserve the Nobel Prize. I am who did this. I am who did that. That is the mind speaking, the unenlightened mind thinking, I have discovered that. Our beloved Imam said to us, no. The human being did not discover it, because the mind itself is Allah's creation. And it is through the mind, in the material realm, we make these discoveries. Now, this is so amazing to speak about science and faith. It's another presentation, hopefully down the road. But let us go back to some of the realities of today's lecture. So let me just continue. So as I've said, the human being is composed of the body-mind complex and is composed of the intellect, which I have identified for you. The intellect is, I keep repeating, which is so important, it is the presence of the divine. The intellect is the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm. So there is the body-mind complex, our body and mind, and there is the ruh, the spirit. And the intellect is at once above the level of the mind, and it is at the center of our being, and it encompasses the intellect, the ruh, same thing, encompasses all other levels of existence. This is why what I said earlier on about the mystery of exploration, through the intellect, we can know how. Come to it in a second. But the human microcosm contains all levels of existence, from the microcosm to the macrocosm, from the macrocosm to the macrocosm. Now, where does reason fit in? Reason is the reflection of the intellect upon the plane of the psyche of the mind and the mind, because it is the reflection. It is this reflection of the light of the intellect upon the human mind creates this reason, because reason can never reach the center or the essence of the human being, nor from that matter the essence of anything else. You can't just use reason to arrive at the essence of things. No matter how much reason concerns itself with experiments and observation, and how far reason carries out the proper functioning of division and analysis, in spiritual matter it remains superficial. You can't use reason in spiritual matters, because remember, logic and reason are part of the function of the mind. So it creates division and analysis. It creates the multiplicity. But the intellect is the purpose by which reason exists. In other words, they are not divided. They are together, but it is a function at the level of the mind. So what can reason do? What can our rationality do? Reason can give peripheral knowledge of the accidental part of the effect, it can give understanding of the external behavior, but not of the essence. You can't understand the essence with reason alone. So, reason, once you separate reason from the intellect, in other words, you cut it off from its source, what happens? This reason, when you cut it off from the guiding light of the intellect, I will explain exactly in a moment, reason then remains limited at the level of what we philosophically call rationalism. And rationalism is not the platform which you can investigate the essence in itself. Let me put it to you in more practical terms. A more practical term is to say, if you ask yourself the question, can I know through my reason what the soul is? Can I know? Can I experience my soul through the act of reasoning alone? And the answer is no. Because if you could use reason and the mind as a basis of that investigation, then we would not need to understand what's anything above and beyond that. Therefore, it says, Rumi actually has said something very interesting about this. He said, it is reason that has destroyed the reputation of the intellect. Imagine this saying, so amazing, so amazing. It is reason that has destroyed the reputation of the intellect. Why? Because the intellect is divine. Reason is a reflection, or the mind is a reflection of that intellect in the plane of human existence. And one of the things the mind does best, as I just mentioned, is the whole concept of analysis and the concept of division. This is how we investigate material things, right? Anyway, so just a quick word about this aspect, which I think might be interesting, just to complete the statement, is simply to say, so there is no confusion. Remember, we are not against what is known as rationalism and logic. Quite the contrary, provided they are understood in the right context. So a distinction must be made between this normal use of reason and logic and what philosophically is known as rationalism. Now, I don't want to get into philosophical thinking because it is distracting to what I want to come in a minute, but it is necessary just to give this clarification. What is the problem with the notion of rationalism? Now, remember the word rationality, or to be rational, is different, although it comes from, rationalism comes from this word, but rationalism as a philosophy, rationalism as a point of view, rationalism as an objective of understanding. What does that mean? What does rationalism do? It makes reason and logic the sole and exclusive instrument of the mind for gaining knowledge and the only criterion for judging the truth. So that is not acceptable to us because logic and reason are not the exclusive criterion to judge the truth. Now remember what happens if you do that. If you make reason and logic the only instrument to gain knowledge, and the truth, you will end up into very serious problems in seeking to understand spiritual matters. And there are many examples to that. I've pointed out in the past, it's just one example, but there are many like this. When you look at the whole notion of materialism in the world, secular materialism, logical positivism, and its other tangents, what do you notice? Even great philosopher, the British philosopher Alfred Jules Ayer, he wrote many philosophical material, but one of his well-known book is called, look at the title, Language, Truth and Logic. Now you go through a philosophy course, reading this book as a textbook, and this is a famous British philosopher, and you read and you understand and you make this the basis of your philosophy, your point of view, you may end up coming to the conclusion and say, you know what, when I read Rumi, so this may be a conclusion, you say, Rumi speaks about this other world, and Rumi speaks about the spiritual world, and Rumi speaks about the soul, and you'll end up saying and say, wait a minute, I learned about language, truth, and logic that the reason and logic is the exclusive criteria to understand the truth. So can you design an experiment to prove what you are telling me about the soul and the other world? And a mystic like Rumi is going to say, how can you design a material experiment in a laboratory to prove matters of the soul? In other words, how can you create physical experiment to validate something that is spiritual in existence? It can never happen because there is no way that in a material experiment in a laboratory of any kind, you can in any way come to the proof or to the cognitive aspect of what the soul might be. So this kind of philosophy, rationalism, says, because you can't do that, that is humbug, that is unreal, that is not true, and don't believe in it. Don't believe in it, because the mystic cannot create an experience, or rather an experiment, to prove cognitively that it and give validity to his claim of knowledge. Wow. That means if you follow rationalism by this point of view, immediately you can throw away everything that is spiritual in life. Everything. And you only stay with your body-mind complex, and that's it. So this is a danger. This is what Rumi says. It is reason that has destroyed the reputation of the intellect. So intellect is divine. Reason and logic is a tool used by the intellect. So what do we say is this, that remember that rationalism, it's a philosophy in the Western context of things, was an attempt to build a system, you might say a closed system, embracing the whole of reality, which it doesn't. And based upon human reason alone, that was an inconsistency with how we in Islam view the whole notion of what the mind should be able to do. Now there is this big body of knowledge that was propagated by this French philosopher of the 17th century, René Descartes, where for Descartes the ultimate criterion of reality itself was the human ego and not the divine intellect of pure being. That's the big problem. Okay? So there was a rupture, there was a break, there was this gulf, there was this breakdown between spirit and matter, between the spiritual and the material. Because Cartesian philosophy of the 17th century became the bedrock, and what eventually happened thereafter till roughly the present time, which again now many forms of spiritual philosophy have begun to re-emerge. But in the Cartesian sense, which is what the material world is all about, makes the ultimate criterion reality the human ego. And I've explained the human ego to you in my lecture on the notion of duality to unity, that it only has access to only that upper part of the mind we call the conscious mind. So, and then of course there is this whole statement from Descartes that the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and all its ramifications. So leave that aside for now, but let me just come quickly to this conclusion here, that making sure that we understand the notion of logic and reason in the context of Islam and our tariqah. Okay? That is so fundamental, because that is the part of the mind related to the divine intellect. So logic according to our tariqah and logic according to Islam. Logic on its own level is an aspect of the truth. Now there are many different forms of logic in mathematics and in philosophy. Let's not go into it. Propositional logic, there is logic into philosophical things, there is whole array of logical brands of expression that is there to enable us to try to arrive conclusively within the framework of that philosophy or mathematics formulation about how we analyze statements and analyze numbers and analyze language to arrive at a certain understanding of the truth. So logic on its own level is an aspect of the truth. And truth, al-haq, truth, al-haq, is one of the name of the Nur. One of the attributes of the Nur is al-haq. So the uses of logic in the worldview of our faith, in the worldview of Islam, the way logic is used is like that of a rope or that of a ladder, if you like, that you climb, which leads the human being from the world of multiplicity. Remember, what does logic, what does reason does? Division and analysis and multiplicity. So logic allows you to go from the world of this multiplicity up to the divine, the world of unity. This is how we use logic. This is how we use reason. That in its own way, this is how it allows us to be participatory in everything that we do. So the whole material world in which we base our sense of logic, sense of reason, where we use analysis as a basis of understanding our faith and everything else. But in its proper functioning, as long as it remains connected with the intellect, and I'll speak about it right now, then logic used in its holistic sense, not divided sense, not in the rationalism sense that you make reason the only criteria to obtain knowledge and to validate the truth, because the truth belongs to al-haq. Al-haq means the nur. It is an attribute of the nur. And if you use logic properly, you use reason properly, it can be used as a ladder to go from the world of multiplicity, the material world, to the divine world and divine understanding. And therefore, we understand the function of the intellect also in that sense. Now, there are these other aspects which I'm not taking right now because I think it will take too long. But simply to speak, because I have another part left to present, and that is the dichotomy in the Western world based on rationalism between reason and revelation and between science and religion. And what is this division between reason and revelation and between science and religion? I think I've given you a little clue already, but I'm going to be, inshallah, with Mullah's blessing and Mullah's grace and mercy, try to put something together about this notion about in science and faith based on how our beloved Imam explained us during the Silver Jubilee. It was an amazing message the Imam gave us. And we need to continue exploring into our scientific society how our faith and the intellect are connected and basically are the basis of everything that we represent in our faith, as the Imam said. So, the intellect, the akal, just to give you a bit more connecting points, signifies both that which binds or limits the absolute in the direction of creation. So remember, is that which binds us. Because remember what I said about the intellect? It's one with the spirit. So it's binding us. It's one. And that which binds the human being to the truth, to the haqiqat, to God Himself. Can you see why the intellect is what makes man Allah's greatest creation? Because it is the intellect that binds us to the nur. Remember what I said a second ago, that the truth, which is al-haq, which logic is an aspect of it. Remember this, don't break the connection. Logic or reason is an aspect of truth, of al-haq. But because al-haq is an attribute of the nur, this logic and reason is tied to the intellect, and the intellect itself is one with the divine, the spirit, with God Himself, as a result of which we say the intellect is the manifestation of the divine. It is divine presence in the human microcosm. And so the intellect becomes everything, through which we need to do everything, through which we exist into everything. And most importantly, now here comes some of the more practical, objectified aspect of it, meaning the intellect used in our material sense. Okay, so a lot more can be said about the Quran itself in the notion of the intellect. I'll mention one or two things. But how about the practical sense? Because this part too was intended, in addition to what I've said, speak about some of the practical application. Practical application. And we can't just leave things at the level of the abstract. We have to see how does that help us in our physical life. Because we are physical in nature. We live in the physical world. We live in the physical realm. We live in the material world. And in this material world, we live, we breathe, we sleep, we earn our education, we earn our living. And in this material world, our beloved Imam says, use your intellect. And the intellect is to be used to understand our faith. Now, I hope the faith part, to some degree, I have conveyed to you some of that information. But let's see how they are joined together. They are not separated. Because the moment you separate, what happens? Rumi comes in. It is reason that has destroyed the reputation of the intellect. Nothing is separated. Everything is united, provided you keep it united. How do we do that? So let's understand first that at the level of the practice of our faith, at the level of the practice of our faith, now being very specific, it is the intellect, it is this akal, which keeps the human being on the straight path, the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim, and prevents him to go astray. So now, if we are to exercise this understanding of Sirat al-Mustaqim, how many times our beloved Imam said, and our beloved Imam has given us blessings to be strong on Sirat al-Mustaqim. Because if we lose sight, if you lose the idea that you are no longer on Sirat al-Mustaqim, you will be going astray. And only the intellect can allow you to stay on the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. But how? We are constantly thinking in the material world, in the material sense, how we are practicing our faith and how we are interpreting our faith at the multiple levels of our existence, and how different people, even within our tariqah, have the interpretation of their faith. And that is what our beloved Imam says. This interpretation is an aspect of the reflection of the intellect. And we cannot create a constraint about it, because it is the notion of the richness in which the intellect expresses itself. Now, one very important aspect about the disconnection part. I've mentioned it perhaps in some way in some of my earlier lectures, but one of a nice way to understand that the disconnection, in other words, if you suddenly begin to say to yourself, okay, if you end up with the Cartesian concept of logic and reason, and you are making yourself, remember this is so important, because I know the question I get for so many people, particularly many younger people and professional people in the midst of our own community in Jamaat, they often question the whole notion of spirituality and the way in which we are practicing our tariqah. And the way they are coming across, they basically are coming across on the basis of saying that the mind, reason, and logic is the only criteria to understand the truth and to create the whole understanding of reality. Forgetting the fact that reality is not only just material or limited to the mind. There are other levels of reality. But they basically say, no, we are in the material reality, and the material reality is the only way and the only thing to do. And anything that is to do with spirituality has no basis or meaning. So what happens? Well, the thing is this, that in the Quran, there are many references that are given about people going astray. Remember what I said a minute ago? That if you are not on the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim, you will be going astray. And if you go astray, then what you've done is you have created a rupture, a disconnection between your intellect, if you like, and the way this intellect is supposed to function wholesomely with the material aspect of your being. So now you make the material aspect of your being the only basis of truth and existence. So in the Quran it says, guess what? The people who've gone astray, are identified as those people who cannot use their intellect properly or wholesomely. Basically, the word is they do not understand, or they do not use their intellect. وَلَا يَكِلُونَ. They do not use their intellect. I'm focused on these terms without going too deeply into other perspective of it. But this word is derived from the word akal or akala, means that which relates to akal, that which ties us to the divine, that which ties us to God. So, in the language of the Quran and Hadith, even the knowledge of science that we study, remember the material universe I'm speaking about, and all of these, and Einstein's theory, and quantum mechanics, and all of that, the purpose of that was this, what I'm about to tell you. That in the language of the Quran and the Hadith, and which is, by the way, what I'm thinking, that what our beloved Imam forcefully told us during the Silver Jubilee about the role of science, that knowledge of science means the knowledge which makes us aware, of Allah, of God, of the Noor, the knowledge that makes us aware of the eternal truth, the eternal verities of the world to come, and the return into the divine. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That is essentially and eventually the whole knowledge of science, the whole purpose of knowledge itself is to give us, to make us aware through our logic and reason, the purpose of God, make us aware of the Creator, make us aware of the Noor, of the ultimate truth, the Hakikat, the Marifah, the world to come and in which we will be returning. He from whom we have come, to whom we will return. So, having said all of that, where does that take us? That takes us to the practical part. So I hope you can follow my argument, whereby I have went from the totally metaphysical from the first lecture. In the second one, repeating some of the metaphysical aspects, meaning spiritual aspect, and from the spiritual coming to the level of the mind, and how the intellect at the level of the mind is reflected, because the mind draws its power of understanding, logic, reason, analysis, and so on from the intellect, provided the intellect stays connected, and how that connection allows us to be who we are into the material world and follow the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim, and not to think if this connection is not there, that we've gone astray, because reason has destroyed the reputation of the intellect by disconnecting yourself through false ideologies, false assumptions. The false assumption is to think the material world is the only reality, because it's only here logic and reason and, if you like, your will functions. Human volition, human reason is here in the material conscious world. Do you remember I mentioned that in my lecture from duality to unity? It was leading to this. So now, where are we at? The human intellect, or the intellect in all its fullness, is remember what I said, it's a divine gift, it's divine in itself. It's the ability to be able to tell apart between the true and the false, between the relative and the absolute, between the truth and the untruth, between what is hakikat, and that is non-hakikat. So, to put it simply, what is the function of the intellect? To be able to tell, let's take just one thing so we are not getting confused, to be able to tell that which is true or false. Let's limit us to that. If the purpose of the intellect is to be able to tell what is the true or the false, then there is another aspect of our being that comes through our physical activity that we call will. Remember the divine will? Sorry, the human will rather? There is a divine will, which is absolute, but there is the human will. And what about the human will? If the intellect is the ability to choose between the true and the false, sorry, let me repeat this. If the human intellect is the ability to tell apart, to discern, whereby you use logic, reason, to tell apart between true and false, the will is the ability to choose. So one is to tell apart. Once you know what is true and false, then the ability to choose, we call it the will. It is the will that allows us to choose between this true and false. Excuse me. And in the act of choosing, what do? When you say it is the ability to choose. Now look at it at a very practical level. Okay? Extremely practical. I mean, just as we are, when we have to make a decision in our life. Is this true? Is this false? Is this right? Is this not right? Is this ethical? Is this not ethical? What is it? How do I know? How will I know? How can I make a decision? I'm so puzzled. I need a greater ability of decision making. So what do? You collect information. How do you know even that information is correct? Information can be false. You can have misinformation, disinformation. How do you know is the truth? Because you can have political truth, you can have a personal truth, but there is also objective truth. How do you know which it is? Now you might say, I'm totally confused. So how do I know I'm making the right decision? To make the right decision at the right place, at the right time means everything. It means everything. So, we say, sometimes, this is not the point I'm trying to make, but I need to just add this. There is such a thing called intellectual intuition. Information that comes from the level of the intellect and filters through as a flash into the consciousness of your mind and tells you, oh, I think this is what it is. And people sometimes call that gut feeling. They call it intuition. Now, do you think this is fiction? No. Do you know what? Some time back, I don't know if it's still there, if you look at the MBA program at Stanford University, they have a course that's called Intuition for the Business Person. Really? You know, some time back, if you spoke about intuition into institutions like these, they'll probably kick you out or lock you in. Intuition was not recognized as a kind of a faculty. But many, many, many years ago, the French microbiologist Louis Pasteur, you know what he said? Intuition favors the informed mind. Wow, what a connection. What we are saying is, what Pasteur said, perhaps in his own way, that don't just think the information you collect is enough to help to give you the decision-making aspect. We are talking about decision-making. There is a higher aspect of your being that after you have collected all the information and you have done everything that needs to be from your physical, material mind, reason, logic point of view, there is the possibility of triggering the response from your intellect, which is that part of your divine, that part of your spirit that is connected to your reason, your logic, your mind, your thinking. All of that is linked to your spirit, to your root, to your atma, that manifests itself as this intellect. Remember, the intellect is the presence of the divine in the human microcosm. The presence of the divine is that nur, that knows everything. It is everything. It's right here within us. Now, let me, before I forget, remind a very important quotation of Rumi, that two actually, which our beloved Imam told us. Well, he mentioned the first one. And what did he say? You remember that quotation? I mentioned it last in my first lecture, because one of the viewers, I think it was Azmina Natu, who sent it to me and said, and you will remember that speech of Hazriman, that he said, the light that lights the eye is the light that lights the heart. And the light that lights the heart is the light of God. Can you imagine the disclosure of this statement by our beloved Imam, what it actually means? The light that lights the eye, it's the light of the intellect, which is the light that comes from the heart, meaning your Atma, your Ruh, your spirit. And that is where all the magic happens. That is the center of our being, the heart. The heart is where is the Akshal Azim, the throne of God, where the Imam sits. That is what it says. It is the light of the heart. And this light of the heart is the light of God. The proof is in front of us. It is undeniable when you look at the connection. It is unbelievable. But that is what our beloved Imam said. Then he also said, he didn't say this, that I remember anyway, but Rumi says this, that he who travels without a guide will take 200 years for a 2-day journey. So how do you make that decision? The bright, the informed, the enlightened will make that the basis of their life and existence. That I want to get back home in 2 days. Remember what I said earlier on? That the whole purpose of knowledge and the whole purpose of science and the whole purpose of the intellect was to make sure that the human being stays aware of God. The light that lights the eye is the light that lights the heart, which is the light of God. Okay? So the light of the eye is the light of the intellect. That is where it functions, it expresses itself, and that is the light of God, that is the heart. So, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the Haqiqat, the eternal verities, the knowledge of the world to come, and in which the spirit will eventually return into. It's that whole purpose of choosing between the true and the false, to remain on Sirat al-Mustaqim, and to choose between the true and the false becomes exactly what it is. That is what the whole purpose of the intellect is, to remain in the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Now, at a very functional level of the mind, there are many different social scientists, psychologists, and others have basically given us a lot to think about the notion of intelligence. And some of you may be aware of that, and some of you may not be, but I would like to bring just to your attention something that you can research yourself. I don't need to take time to do that here, because I need to bring this thing to a conclusion. And let me just emphasize this, that people like Howard Gardner, who's a Harvard psychologist in the field of cognitive science, that is an area that I happen to be involved in, and basically says that there are multiple types of intelligences. Now, those who are in education will be able to relate this very lovingly and very empathetically. And what are we discovering about human intelligence? Now, remember, I want you, in bringing this thing to you in a very functional way, in a very practical way, and there are other parts which I will speak a little later on, in a very practical way, to think what we as human beings, through the exercise of understanding the human mind and human intelligence through the mind, we are understanding. So they say that there are multiple types of intelligences, and 9 types of intelligences. There are more, but there are 9 types of intelligences that have been identified. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details, but you can look into these and you'll be beautifully surprised. And you can type, I suppose, Howard Gardner or Google or Wikipedia and look for the 9 types of intelligences. And what will you discover? There is the naturalist intelligence, nature smart. There is the musical intelligence, which is people with musical abilities. Logical, mathematical intelligence, number and reason smart. Existential intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, linguistic intelligence. There is intrapersonal intelligence. There is spatial intelligence. And these are the 9 intelligences which, in a sense, currently is there in the construct of what people identify as intelligence. But you know what? There are other forms of intelligence that I bring to your attention. There is, for example, one other thinker brought up the notion of, well, he's another psychologist, who brought the notion of emotional intelligence on top of these 9. And then there is spiritual intelligence. Now that is interesting to us. That is really interesting to us. And when you think about spiritual intelligence, a lot needs to be said about it. And one of the things that we can say about spiritual intelligence is when that spiritual intelligence allows us to understand the role of modern science and the role of spiritual science, right? Because it's spiritual intelligence. So what is the role of modern science? Now, I hope you forgive me, I'm taking extra time, but I'm adding this because I believe it will add more explanation. When you think about modern science, and I'm sure by now you know with the explanation I given. So physical intelligence, based on those 9 or 10 intelligences, and then you have spiritual intelligence, perhaps the 11th intelligence. There may be other forms that will emerge. But remember, spiritual intelligence as expressed today is not exactly what I am leading to you today, but it kind of is getting there, but it's been investigated. But I'm using spiritual intelligence very purposefully for my presentation to actually mean intelligence that comes from the spirit, okay? Not just an investigation, not just an analysis, but actually it is from the top down, that intellectual intuition that emerges from the spiritual, from the spirit, and spiritual intelligence, right? So we have physical intelligence based on science, and we have spiritual intelligence based on the intellect or the spiritual intelligence. So modern science is related to the logical, rationalistic universe that is emanating from its philosophical worldview, as I mentioned, of the 17th century, through its reliance upon human reason as the ultimate criterion of truth. Okay? So remember this, everything that is related to the human criterion of truth. Reason. Reason and reason alone, not any further. It's limiting reality to the physical domain, and it's restricting of relation between the human being and nature to the level of the senses and reason, and analyzing the results of the sense perception. What I'm saying to you in simple language, the physical sciences, in a way, relies on the five senses that we have, its extensions through the level of reason itself, and logic, and analysis, and division, and multiplicity through reason to make sense of the world in which a human being lives, and it ties the human being to these five senses and reason. And therefore, the human perception, the human understanding about the world in which we live is purely material. It doesn't go beyond. There is no talk about God. There is no talk about the spirit. There is no talk about other levels of reality. So in many, many ways, the modern science, the science in which the society relies on today, is pretty well locked up into that. Although there are many scientists who think otherwise. But that is not a common norm, because you will never find a talk about the soul into a physics textbook. Doesn't exist. Not yet anyway. Unless you do spiritual physics, then you'll know. But you will never find the soul in a physics textbook or in a chemistry textbook. Or, for that matter, into a biology textbook that speaks about the human biology. For another time. But then what is spiritual science? Or if you like, what we say, science that is of the metacosmic reality. Spiritual sciences are related to the metaphysical and cosmological or the metacosmic principle in relying upon the language of, number one, symbolism, which I have not spoken so far, but which is unnecessary right now, and is basing themselves upon the hierarchic nature of the cosmos, and in considering the analogies which exist between the macrocosm and the microcosm, which I've spoken to you earlier on, and relying upon the intellect, which goes through, the intellect pierces through the phenomena to their noumenal essence, meaning to the phenomena to the essence, in addition to reason and the senses. I hope you're following me. That is the difference between physical science and the spiritual science. So when you think about spiritual science, it uses the intellect, and it goes through the physical, right up to the spiritual level of the cosmos. Remember, the first thing created by the Nur was the intellect. And what is the intellect? The presence of the divine, the presence of God in the human microcosm. It's the manifestation of the divine in the human microcosm. Now, let us take what I just said in a very practical, down-to-earth reason, in very down-to-earth practical connection and function. So, let me come back to a fundamental principle about the link between the divine intellect and the human intellect. You remember the link? Our beloved Imam was very clear. It is the divine intellect that transcends, goes beyond, but informs the human intellect. You remember my cosmic pyramid? The cosmic pyramid of the intellect mentioned that first part about the intellect and how the divine intellect, which is outside, that transcends, but it informs the human intellect. How is that connection possible? how is that connection remain, and how is that connection transmitted at the level of the mind and body for our material function? How is that possible? How can that be? Because, think about it this way, let me put it the other way. If that connection was 100%, we would have no problem. Because the intellect knows through synthesis, as I mentioned before. It means the intellect is the source from which all that knowledge comes in. It knows the truth. It is al-haq. It is the haqiqat. There is nothing more to be known at that level. So you then may wonder, then why do I need to choose? Why do I need to make a decision? Where do I get that information? At the material level, why do I need that information if my intellect actually knows the answers to those questions? Why do I have to conduct that search? Why do I have to do research if it is all known? Remember the word research? What does it mean? To find what may already be there. But we call it research because we are rediscovering what was already there in some way that we didn't see it before. Anyway, that could be one of the things. Research by no means means something that a human being has suddenly newly invented and fabricated. It means out of nothing. Excuse me, that's not the case. That has never happened. Even the artificial elements that we have created in the periodic table are not that construct. There's a reason behind it. They are made of elements that we already know. Anyway, what's the point of connection? Let me be very specific so that we don't lose ourselves. Because if we miss this point, then we will hopefully understand why reason, or to put it simply, why there is guided intellect in Sirat al-Mustaqim and there is misguided reason and logic at the level of the mind, or misguided intellect. Actually, the intellect can never be misguided because it is part of the spirit in that technical sense. Or we say in a practical sense, because we say, oh, I'm an intellectual. What do you think an intellectual means? Someone who has an amazing ability of the mind to do what they did into that field of learning and research, is full of knowledge, full of understanding, full of recognition and full of admission about there, and that's a marvelous thing. Shukr, it's wonderful in the world to think about that. But does that mean this person has an enlightened intellect in that spiritual sense? Not necessarily. Because Descartes, as I mentioned, René Descartes, is a very intelligent human being. He was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, and he was many other things. But he had this problem about understanding anything higher than the level of reason and logic. And therefore he called it cogito ergo sum. I am, therefore I exist. He didn't say I am because I'm spirit and other things, or I'm God. But remember Hazrat Imam's word. The light that lights the eye is the light of the heart, and the light of the heart is the light of God. So, what makes the connection? What is that connection? I have mentioned it before. I mention it right now. And I would like that this be understood, not in its just limited way. This has to be understood at the level of creation and metacosmos. The sound. The sound is the link, is the nexus that creates the link between the human intellect at the level of the mind and our practice and our practice of the faith and our duties and obligation in the world and so on, with the divine intellect, the soul. That's why it was so important to speak about the application, and I'm coming to a couple of things about the application. If you accept this proposition, which is not just a proposition, it's a reality, the sound is the basis of that link, that nexus. And remember, the interpretation and the formulation and the practice of the form of the song today and the symbolism with which it represents and everything else, that has not changed. The forms have changed. The symbolism has not changed. The formulation and form, they change according to the guidance of the Holy Imam to the Jamaat. To put it more broadly, in the way revelations come to human beings, whether it is through the Vedas, through the Torah, through the Injil, meaning the Gospels, or put it simply, through the Old Testament or the New Testament, through the Quran and other revealed books, this principle of what we call the song. Other people have their different names. As I mentioned in the Quran, it says Ushr Allah, it says Khums, it says Zakat. All these things tied together. We, in our tariqah, we call the song. The principle of tithing in Christianity and Judaism. The principle of dashans in the religions in the subcontinent and in other forms and species. This universal principle of dasan is the nexus, the connecting point. It is the link, it is the chain of the human intellect to the divine intellect. And if that chain is broken or unplugged, meaning if there is no dasan, if there is no practice of the dasan as given to us in all the revelations of the world, and which is a message every single prophet has brought into it. And you should see, for example, just to give you one example alone, well, maybe I'll give you two. One example is, look at in the New Testament, into the Gospels of Christ, into the Injil, as the Quran says. What did Jesus Christ, Isa Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, has said about the concept of tithe and the song? You will be amazed the foundation that in Christianity, what the song is, what tithing is. Look into the Torah also, into the Old Testament. What Prophet Moses, Musa Nabi says, alayhi salam. Let me give you a third example. Look into Bhagavad Gita, the songs of the divine. Look what Gita says. You will be flabbergasted how the 8th manifestation of the Imam speaks about in the Gita. What we say, what Shri Krishna says in the Gita. So, these are divine books as understood by the communities concerned. They are manifestation of the divine words. And no one can say they are not. Because our beloved Imam and our faith teaches us that every revelation that has come on the face of this earth, they are manifestation of Allah's revelation. So is the Gita, so is what the Sri Ram brought, that which the Mahabharata in its manifestation, where the teachings of Sri Ram, what the 4 Vedas speaks about, and eventually what the Bible, the Old Testament, New Testament, and of course certainly the Holy Quran. All these are holy revelations. They come from the source of the Nur. Nobody can deny that. That is what the Quran says. All of them have come from the same source. Hence this kind of unity within humanity. So what did they say? What was one common factor among others? One common factor is the unity of God, which Islam calls Tawheed. The other common factor is the song, in their own languages in various manifestations. So let me come back to our reality. The song is the connection, and that gives the principle of cosmic balance. Now you can understand the term. The whole creation, the whole physical creation, even the spiritual cosmos, is in resonance, is in harmony, is in development according to the divine plan and functions according to this balance because of the sun. But you see, the human being, you can go out of harmony, out of Sirat al-Mustaqim by bringing your conscious ego by saying, no, I don't believe in God. He doesn't exist. Remember what the Quran says? La yakilun, malfunction of the intellect. Why? There can be many reasons. One of them is rupture. Why? No, the sun. The sun isn't what you think. But the phone today perhaps makes you go crazy to think and deludes you, creates the delusion because of your material engagement. Oh, the material world is so important and so pervasive into my existence that this materialism that has created a veil of my material passion and created a delusion into my mind that the material world in which I live is the sole existence, and therefore deny and ignore the spiritual realm. Remember one thing our beloved Imam says? He said it in the Silver Jubilee. If the material pursuit, try to remember all the words, becomes the exclusive objective of life, it will engender an evil vacuum of destructive forces. This is what the mind is capable to do when there is no link to your soul or spirit. It will create a vacuum of this destructive force. Therefore, our beloved Imam says, the role of the intellect in the faith. How is faith guiding you in the understanding of this intellect? So at the level of decision making, there is the expression of various intelligences that come to us. But where do you think that comes from to us too? How is it possible that the human being has all these 9 intelligences and spiritual intelligence? But spiritual intelligence comes from the spirit, can only be functional through its channel of intellectual intuition when the sun is there. Now, couple of quick points. For the sake of completeness, I have to say this. So, when it comes to all these intelligences and it comes to our function about decision making, and I want to focus here on the learning part, because the learning, education, remember what our beloved Imam says, is at the forefront of what our tariqah says, and it gives the intellect and education a very high level of importance. And there are so many beautiful, amazing educational interventions in our life today brought up by educators of various different levels to allow the human intellect at the level of reason, logic, participation to become better and better and to become even more adapted to, hopefully you would think, the society in which we live. Because remember, on the one hand, there is us, the body-mind complex, our intelligence, our logic and reason, our mind, and there is the divine intellect, our spirit, our ruh, and at the same time, the world in which we live, which is the one in which we interface about trying to learn from this world, where they say change is the only constant, and when knowledge is actually, well, multiplying, information is multiplying every 12 months or less. There is double the information we have than we have 12 months ago, even more 12 months from now. How does the human mind and the human learning can cope with that? Very big problem. But that is which human beings have been trying to solve. How do you become adaptable to the avalanche of knowledge that is coming up from various domains of learning in the human realm of domain. No human being today can claim to have that capacity. Yet, we have the human intellect. But I'm talking in terms of functionality, decision making, practical level. So there are a number of technologies, we call them learning technologies. As an example, I'm giving this to you. There are probably more there related to these different intelligences. But I am concerned with how we use our spiritual intelligence in a practical way, remembering that spiritual and material intelligence are connected by the notion of dasant, which allows the flow, allows the connection, allows the nexus. It's like you are plugged in into the source of power. The source of that power, which is a divine intellect. And your plug-in is the dasant. If you unplug yourself, the other end, which is you, you're unplugged. All you're left with are the factors of your human logic and thinking, which basically functions at the minimal light level. Now, leave that aside, simply to say, assuming you have that wholesome connection, what then happens? There are certain technologies you can use to enhance your learning. But that learning requires the understanding of this divine intellect, so that you can make that learning and those technologies a lot more practical, useful in life, on the basis of allowing your mind to guide you in greater and better learning. Now, there are whole courses to be learned about all of these, which obviously I cannot do here. So I'm giving you just a 2-minute overview about that. We have a number of new learning technologies. One of the technologies is called learning to learn. You might say, what? Why do I need to learn? Learning to learn. Am I not learning? Have I not been learning all my life? Not at all. Learning to learn has a new meaning and definition. It means learning to learn. So when in this particular technology of learning, excuse me, we have different components. I'm just mentioning a few. How does the human brain learn? How to improve the ability to process information? How to improve memory? A problem which many people have, at least psychologically. And in terms of the practical tools, we use tools like mind mapping, memory techniques, metapositive thinking, and other tools that are the outshoots of these and others. We have another technology called learning to know. So the first one was learning to learn. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. In the learning to learn, you learn about how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, because information becomes obsolete. And then learning to know. That's the second technology. The first one was learning to learn. Learning to know has to do with what research in brain science is revealing us about the power of the brain, but indirectly about the power of the mind, and indirectly about the power where the mind derives that power. Learning to know also teaches us how to access the unconscious mind. Now remember I mentioned from duality to unity lecture, the notion of the unconscious, where our experiences is our store of knowledge and other things. I only mentioned a few brief things. But in learning to know, this is the idea of know, how you access the unconscious mind, and how to think intuitively. Remember I mentioned spiritual intuition, spiritual thinking. It has a scientific basis. So visualization, relaxation, intuitive thinking, offlining, all of these are aspects of learning to know. And then learning to think. Learning to think. How to break out of the fixed patterns. Remember, Wala Bapa said you can't constrain the intellect to just some things. You can't constrain it. It has to be given the freedom to interpret, to think, to be participatory in society and everything else. So how to break out of fixed patterns of thinking, of thought, and search for creative ideas. How to take the confusion out of thinking. How to get people thinking cooperatively, meaning group thinking and more. That's the learning how to think. Are you not thinking all the time? We are thinking all the time. But we have to find a mechanics and methodology that suits the mind to be able to do that. So that's part of how learning to think. How about learning to achieve? We are in a world that demands achievement, meritocracy, best practices, decision making. That's what Mola Bapa says to us. So in the context of learning to achieve, how to reach the level of peak performance, how to mentally rehearse high achievement, how to create, how to act with passion and energy around the clear crystal vision. What is it in us that will allow us to do that? How do you become passionate? Use that spiritual force and energy that we have to do that. Learning to achieve. It's called Olympian thinking. How these Olympic athletes win the gold medal. How do they achieve it? What is the gold medal in learning to achieve intellectually? And then there is learning to vision. Wow, that's a big one. Remember, one of the things the Imam says is the vision. How we create anticipatory vision, how to anticipate. So learning to vision is how to anticipate future direction. And I mean that scientifically. We're not talking about crystal ball, we're not talking about tarot cards, we're not talking about any other form of psychic manipulation. We are talking about scientific principles that guide the functioning of this mind that is vast in its making. So learning to vision is how to anticipate future direction, how to design a preferred future to maximize and benefit personally, and if you are part of some group of people or organization, how you can benefit your organization. And then how to build a strategic plan to translate vision into action. Vision into action. Vision into action. Our beloved Imam Muslim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, first comes knowledge and then action. Look at that. Vision first and then action. How will you vision? What will allow you in your mind to have that vision so that you can then take the action and be at the forefront of things? If you knew that secret, it will always be at the forefront. So, learning to vision. And we use things like strategic visioning, scenario writing, future history. At the level of learning to know, we use creative thinking in addition to analytical thinking. We use intuitive thinking, lateral thinking, and many other forms of thinking. They're all there in front of us so that we have the ability to have multiple tools about the mind. This is like a toolbox of the mind, whereby we carry with us and we adapt ourselves to all these challenges that the world of information and technology, the knowledge society, as our beloved Imam said, is posing to us. So intellect at the very practical level requires that participation. And I'm going to bring in one of my presentations one of this whole aspect about the notion of how the past and the present and the future, from this particular from the point of view of a knowledge society, how we look at it. It has a fundamental impact in how we understand some of the aspects our beloved Imam has asked us to look into it, to search and to understand. For example, the faith of our forefathers. Remember this. I have to say this to you. Remember this. This was a Diamond Jubilee message. And our beloved Imam reminded the whole Jamaat globally that it is the faith of our forefathers that will enable us, that will help us in times of crisis and in terms that we're going through. Do not forget these diamonds Imam has told us. So we need to explore the faith of our forefathers. What the past, how the past is relevant to our present and the future. What is that? So I'm doing some research, and I hope down the road I'm able, with Mawla's grace and mercy and blessing, to bring that to you. But to conclude today's session, what do we do materially in a practical sense as part of our decision making so that we can be sure that we remain on Sirat al-Mustaqim, and we can be sure that our material, physical, dunya life is guided by our deen, because our beloved Imam has said, deen and dunya have to coexist together, not separately, and making sure that we are meritocratically oriented, we have best practices, not only in the material sense, but also spiritual sense. We are able to fulfill our material and spiritual duties, and we can, in this world, as our beloved Imam desire, that we should live successfully, happily, and have a happy life into this material realm, guided by our faith, and making sure that we remain on that path of Noor or path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Question mark. I know it's been a long question. So let me, in my own humble way, with utmost humility, present to you a response. And my response is this, based on the understanding of our faith, our tariqah. Number one, in order to achieve all those things that I mentioned and more, never forget, constantly keep in mind that our faith, our tariqah, our practice, our interpretation is that of the Noor, is a part of Noor, is the knowledge of Noor, it is the manifestation of the Noor, and everything that we do is seeking, searching, and conducting ourselves towards that Noor. That's point number one. That being so, everything we do in our material life, even if you're a scientist, even if you are a literate, if you're an artist, if you are whatever profession you belong to, in the material sense, remember, it is the intellect within you, connected to the divine intellect, connected to the Noor, that is constantly guiding us. And in order for that to happen, do not forget the principle of the song. The song isn't simply what you think in a limited way. It is the substance of salvation and intellectual and manifestation of the divine light into the intellect. Do not forget that. Thirdly, whatever activities you do, professionally or otherwise, every moment of your existence, bring light into yourself. Continue to bring light. Continue to bring light. That light will remove all the veils and all the obstacles and all the negativities in front of the mind, so you may realize the brilliance, you may realize the luminous intellect within you. Only light can bring back that light. meaning in the material world, in the practice, in our faith in the material world. How you do that? Everything we do is nur. And one of the simplest ways to do that, first and foremost, remember the foundational principle. First, the song. It's an aspect of the nur. Secondly, our three dua. That is a prayer of the nur. You can think the rest. Fourthly, whenever we participate in our Jamaat Khana, it's the practice of the nur. Fourthly, even though you may not be able to go to Jamaat Khana, in whatever situation of condition or limitation we are in now, it doesn't mean the connection is broken. What it does mean, we have a greater challenge, but we also have with us the mercy, grace, and blessings of our Imam, so that we have lost nothing. And that mercy, that grace, that blessing of the Imam means that more than ever, we follow the guidance our beloved Imam has given us. And that is, carry a tasbih. Carry a tasbih. And call on the tasbih. Our Imam says, the name of Allah, that is the Nur. The name of Hazrat Ali, the Nur manifest. The Nur of the names of the Imam or the Imam of the time, or the name of the Holy Prophet. It's the Nur manifest. So, call on the tasbih, meaning do not break your connection. And remember what I have said before is guided by our Imam. In our practice, never mind about how others feel and think about it. In our practice, the continuous and continuously remembering the name of the Imam of the time is the highest form of worship. And what a great bounty and blessing that is. In what sense? In every sense. Because when you are remembering, let me just make this clear, because we are speaking about Nur. When you are remembering the name of Allah, what are you doing? You are remembering the name of the Nur. The name of the Hazrat Ali is the name of the Nur. The name of the Imams or Imam of the time or the Holy Prophet, it is the name of the Nur. We are talking about identification with the Nur all the time. Now think about this. Nur is light. Your mind, your thinking, your focus, your constant engagement in whatever you're doing materially is with the Nur of Maula Bapa. Constantly remembering his name. Ya Ali, Ya Allah, Ya Muhammad. The names of the Imam. Whatever tasbih the Imam has given us. Remember this. Whatever tasbih the Imam has given us. Call on the tasbih. Keep connection with the Nur of Maula Bapa. That is the reason. And that Nur that comes in us. Remember, the intellect is the manifestation of the divine in the human macrocosm. You're constantly bringing to your consciousness, physical consciousness, that light, the Nur, all the time. You're thinking about Maula Bapa in your way. Through his name, through the tasbih, through the Nur, through Ya Allah, through whatever combination you want. What happens is that the constant engagement with that thought when you're sleeping, when you're waking, in every aspect of your life, eventually continues to strengthen you spiritually. We are using spiritual science. This is an aspect of spiritual science. We are scientifically but spiritually motivating, validating your practice. And you can see the difference. And you will be able to see the difference. So remember. Do you remember what our beloved Imam says? Remember, 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 and never forget. He has said that. And there is one other farman, I think he made it somewhere in East Africa, And again, I have to paraphrase. And when the Imam was speaking about Deen and Dunya, and he spoke about the blessings, and the Imam said, not only material, but also not only material. And when he said no, not only material, he said no, 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 11 times. And one of the listeners, I don't know if she's here today, Karima Juta reminded me, and he said, do you remember what our Imam said there? And I was so charged in that thing, and I remember what she said, and remember that what our beloved Imam said. He said, no, 11 times. And he said, but first spiritually, and then materially. So the Imam says no 11 times. I think we need to really ponder about this, that we are just too strongly engaged materially to be able to really realize spiritually what it is. Now there is so much to be said about it, but I needed to say this thing, the practical side of the intellect. And I'm so motivated by your messages, your support, your prayers, that you are making the time to hear me and to listen to me. And with Mawla's grace and mercy, and with Mawla's inspiration and light, that we can bring this thing at the forefront and try to understand the inner meaning and so amazing aspect of our practice within our physical life and physical world. So simply to conclude, add light. Add light to everything that you do by the constant remembrance and by expressing gratitude, shukrana, to Mola Bapa. Every step that you take, every breath that you take, every memory that you can bring, anything that you do, physically, spiritually, don't lose the connection. Add light. Light is added by remembrance, by consciously linking ourselves to Mola Bapa himself, in whichever way that you do, whatever way that you do. And one powerful way to do it is certainly to always express your gratitude to him. And this gratitude becomes the source of immense blessing. So remember, add light, add light, add light, stay connected. And the more you add, the more you will find that spiritual intuition and the spiritual part of your being guiding you in the right path, at the right place. That happens when you allow and submit yourself to the divine intellect, which is Mola Bapa himself. So that, having said that, do not forget that in our daily life, in our daily exercise of living, what is it we need more? What is it we need more than anything else? And this is the amazing part of the practice of our tariqah, whether they are young or old. And I'm hoping that younger people and the professional segment of our Jamaat, and I know there is a huge number in our presentation that we do every week, and I get their concern and I get their messages, and I'm saying to you today, don't limit yourself with thinking that your mind and your brain is only the basis of a response and answer to questions and challenges. So what is it that we need more? If you think you need support, if you think you need courage, if you think you need wisdom, which comes from the intellect, if you think you need enlightenment, and look at that one, that comes from the divine intellect, which comes from the nur of Mola Bapa. If you think you need all of these, so you can deal with your everyday issues, and in the issues you have to deal with every day, what was the guidance our beloved Imam said? Call on the tasbih. Call on the tasbih. This is the connection. Don't lose that. It means add light, add light, add light, add light. Light takes away darkness. Add light. You understand what I'm saying? Add light. Keep adding light. And you add light by constantly taking refuge into what our faith guides us into. Our faith says Sirat al-Mustaqim. Follow Mola Bapa wherever he is. Follow Mola Bapa wherever he is. And that Sirat al-Mustaqim, that nur, that light is Mola Bapa's farman. Don't let a single day go out of your hand where you did not put light into your intellect by reading Mola Bapa's holy farmans. Farman is light. May Mola bless you. Mola be with you every step, every breath of the way. May Mola Bapa enlighten your intellect.
Amen.
May Mola Bapa bring to fruition and bring to realization all your wishes with barakah, with
Amen.
success.
Amen.
May Mola Bapa makes you all the highest in the meritocracy spiritually and materially.
Amen.
May the consciousness, the remembrance of Mola Bapa be with us every breath, every step in all that we do.
Amen.
Bring light into our spirit, to bring light into our thinking, light
Amen.
into our heart, light
Amen.
into every step, every breath that we take.
Amen.
Let us make our consciousness completely united with
Amen.
Mola's remembrance, with Mola's love, with Mola's affection.
Amen.
May we continue to pray that Mola bless us with strength in our dasam, with
Amen.
strength in our iman,
Amen.
and may Mola accept all our prayers.
Amen.
And may Mola bless us with the support, the courage, the wisdom, the enlightenment in all our tasks, in everything that we do.
Amen.
And may we feel Mola Bapa's presence, which is
Amen.
his highest source of light and nur in
Amen.
all aspects of our existence, from
Amen.
waking to sleeping, during sleep, and in everything that we do. May
Amen.
it be a journey of light for all.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you very much.
Amen.
And Yali Mother.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. HASSAM, for explaining us the difference between the intellect, soul, mind, and reason. Your presentation was very enlightening. And let me thank you on behalf of all the participants present here for your utmost commitment to share your knowledge every week and for your time. Sharing knowledge is one of the key factors in performing seva, and you are facilitating in this process.
Amen.
I pray that Mola always keeps you in good health,
Amen.
and he blesses you and your family with lots of happiness
Amen.
and barakat,
Amen.
barakat,
Amen.
barakat.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amen.
I know there are some participants who sometimes would like to stay behind to be able to have a word and everything else. So we will leave I will request the host, Lakshmi, to see whether we can do that. And
Yes,
if
of
we
course.
can.
Yes, we can do that. So today you don't want to have a Q&A? Would you like
If there are a question or two, I'm happy to take it within the context of the subject, so that
Yes.
we can continue adding information there.
Okay. So the questions are coming, but there were some questions which were submitted in the by email.
Yes.
So one of the question was, I think there is a need of clarification between the question was about the difference for non-Ismaili versus Ismaili between intellect and soul.
Well, I cannot say necessarily how that might appear in understanding with non-Ismailis, although it may resonate with them. But I think maybe the one way we can say is to say that in Islam we don't know this division.
Yeah.
In Islam we don't have a division. Everything is considered part of that unity. So with non-Ismaili, if I can perhaps interpret that to mean that in the secular sense, there may be this division between the spiritual and the material. But in Islam, we know not of this division. And we consider the material and the spiritual to be united. They work together, they intertwine together. And I think that would be more than enough for them to think about what we need, unless they had a much more specific question related to that.
Well, it was related to pregnant women. So I did not maybe understand properly the question, but I think it was related to the soul and the intellect, the difference.
I'm not exactly sure how the question relates to a pregnant woman, unless it has to do with some things I may have mentioned way back in the past about in accordance with the formulation given by the Holy Prophet and Hazrat Ali alayhi salam, and also mentioned in some of our dinams that when is it that the soul or the spirit enters the womb? And Hazrat Ali has said in the Najul Balaga, and the Holy Prophet has said in the Hadith, which is reflected in the teachings of our dinam. And Hazrat Ali speaks about 4 periods of 40 days. 4 periods of 40 days. And says in the end of that 4th period of 40 days, it's when the spirit manifests itself in the womb. Now I know it requires a lot more explanation, and we have the explanation, I can assure you, in its fullest detail. But that's part of that spiritual physiology. And it is very interesting to know, because it's part of knowledge to know how does a life, right from the fertilization process between the sperm and the egg and becomes the zygote, and how it evolves into the fetus and eventually into the embryo and then into the fetus. And then we know very well the physical stages, and they are amazing, and more so than ever before. And there are some Muslim thinkers in connection with biologists and embryologists. They have even tried to commensurate the physical development in the womb with some of the Quranic ayats about the soul in the womb and its growth and the various phases of manifestation. And others have gone even further than that. So that is an interesting aspect. But then there is the other aspect, how do we actually understand the whole process spiritually, like when the egg is fertilized by the sperm and its development, what happens there? And the first thing that happens, amongst other things that happens to every single life form, is the heartbeat. The heartbeat is the first thing that is understood and realized that life is there. But what is that life of the heartbeat? And how is that different? And I think that's what the question was leading to. How is that different than, the soul and the spirit? Well, I want to go into those technicalities, but let me just say this, that this requires a lecture in itself, which I will do. And simply put, it's all part of the Spirit's manifestation into that embryo and eventually into the fetus. So we view it that way. We see it that way. In fact, according to the Quran, we see that as Allah's miracle when a life is growing into the womb. And that is indeed one of the greatest understanding about the miracle of God, which is the human creation. So next comment or question.
Okay, so next question is our Imam is the 50th peer. Our holy peers have created and sung Ginans. What is the difference between the two peers?
There is no difference at all. No difference at all. The only thing is this: our beloved Imam, as Imam, he has decided to maintain the two offices that are his, the office of the Imam and the office of the Peer. And he is himself, as the Peer and Shah, functioning in that holistic unity. So we do not divide it. We do not divide it. It is not ours to divide. But what it does do, it re-emphasizes whatever our holy peers of the past have done and have articulated about our faith. And one thing, to give you some, an anchor point, our beloved Imam has said to us that I would like that the wonderful tradition of the Ginans should be maintained from generation and generation to come. It's a farman of the Imam, but the Imam is validating what the holy peers have done. This is what the question says. Other peers have composed Ginans and done other things. So Mullah Bapa himself, as the 49th Imam and the 50th peer, is validating that spiritual knowledge and literature in our practice. And by extension, our beloved Imam, when he mentions Qasidas and other devotional literature, they are equally validated for our Jamaat, because it is another expression of our spirituality, another expression of our practice in those other parts of the world which we did not know before. And Shukr Mawla, with Mawla's blessing, those of us who did not know, now we know more and continuing to know more about our other brothers and sisters and their traditions, the tradition of Nasr Khusro and the tradition of Pir Sadruddin coming together. So that is what our beloved Imam, in both of his capacities, are reminding us.
Next question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so there are a few questions I will try to about soul. So there is one which is there is a question in Bandagi, send your soul to me. Please elaborate on that. And there is the next question, which is what is the difference between soul, ruh, and jeev?
Now the first question, I think you know very well, these matters are always between the believer and their practice. And in respecting spiritual ethics that the Imam is asked us to follow, and to respect the prerogative of that which is of the Imam, I cannot comment on that issue or matter in the way it has been asked. However, if this individual just seeks maybe some understanding, then I'm happy to respond to it at a personal level. But I cannot do that here because it's not of a concern to everyone and everywhere. It's a very personal thing. And even personally, I'm limited to say whatever I need to say. But I don't want to tell this individual that I cannot help or I have no response. So if you wish, you may contact me individually. But matters related to such spiritual practice, we really cannot make that a public thing. Now the second question, what was the difference between soul and Jeev?
Jeev.
Yes.
And also there is another question which is similar between Ruh and Atma.
Okay. So let me take that last one first because it's much easier. So Ruh is Arabic word. Like I keep mentioning that statement, Al-Ruh min Amra Rabbi. So it comes from the Quran, and Ruh is Arabic, Atma is Sanskrit. Exactly the same thing. It's just difference in language. And we would say the word spiritus or intellectus in Arabic, in Greek or Latin, to me it's exactly the same thing. So, Ruh in Arabic, Atma in Sanskrit, spiritus or intellectus in Greco-Latin. Same, we are speaking of the same entity. Now the other question, the difference between soul and Jeev. The simplest way to understand it is this, that as I have mentioned to you before, perhaps not in so many details, hopefully in the hope of not creating confusion. The human being has not one body, which is the physical body, but we have actually three bodies. And when you put these three bodies together and you add the Ruh or the Atma, it becomes a living being. I'm being very simplistic, okay, because I don't have time to give the details right now, but you have to understand where it's coming from. So once you add the soul or add the Atma, it becomes a living being. Now, the physical body, you understand what it is. The next body, which is integrated in the physical, like a hand inside a glove, it's called the subtle body. So the subtle body is not just anywhere out there, it's here with you. We are talking about your subtle body. And your subtle body is made up of, in the general structure, of three major components or sheets. And these three sheets is the vital sheet, it is the sheet of the mind, and the sheet of the intellect. Okay. Now, in English, it's very difficult to translate all of them, but I've done it just very roughly. So that soul that enters the womb, when it comes, and it comes at a time when this part of the sheet of the subtle body is there already by virtue of the fertilization process. That sheet functions inside the womb, and of course after when we are born also, as Jeev. And that is what creates eventually the structure of what we call the mind that develops through its natural process. And you can see this is not a physical process because science knows very little about the mind. We know about the body, we know how the brain develops, how the various organs continue to develop inside the embryo and the fetus eventually, but we know very little about the mind. So the mind, if I can put it very simply, in a very, very, very simple way, so we don't get confused, the mind is your jiv, and then your soul is your ruh. But the jiv only exists because of the ruh. I hope that clarifies.
There is also a question which is related. Explain more about heart vs soul vs jiv. So it's linked to the previous question.
Yes. Well, let me answer it at least in one sentence.
Yeah.
And I can answer it by that quotation of Rumi that Mola Bapa gave. The light that lights the eye is the light that lights the heart. It's the light of God. The light of the eye is the light of the intellect, soul, mind, you name it. But that is the light that lights the heart. Why the heart? That is where we actually are. That is the center of our being. I mean, who we are and everything that we are is the heart. That's why the heart plays such a symbolic role. But I'm not just speaking about the physical heart. We are calling it the spiritual heart, which is the ruh, the atma. And that's why the Ginan says, Dil. I've quoted this Ginan many times from, I think it's the first part of Saloko. Say, Dil mahe deval pujiye. Dil mahe sanya ape vase. Dil mahe sanya ape vase and dil mahe deve dua. All the magic happens in the heart. In the heart, the divine lives. In the heart is the abode of the divine. In the heart is where the divine manifests himself. And it is in the heart you will get his didar, his vision. That means that is where the center of your being is. And we shall speak about the heart, inshallah, at some point. So that is that. And the light that is in the heart is the light of God. You see how Mola connected the light of God with the heart. So enough for right now, but when we take the details at some future time, then hopefully the details will emerge.
Okay, the next one is Mola Bapa has mentioned in his Farman that it is up to each individual to follow the path of intellectualism and to find in that path the goal which is faith, to understand the creation of Allah. So how do we understand the goal as faith? Does it mean Iman and understanding Allah's creation with faith and Iman?
I think in some way the question is given its own answer.
Yeah.
which is
It's
nice.
a confirmation, I think, the person is asking.
So in between what I've explained today and in between what our beloved Imam is asking us to do, first of all, there is the recognition, what the Imam is saying to us, that every human being are at a different level of that intellectual pursuit and intellectual enlightenment. So how you might do to understand the creation of Allah using your intellectual abilities is an act of faith. That's what Imam has said, I think, in some other place. Definitely it is an act of faith. But remember what our beloved Imam said. In doing so, it makes it clear it is the creation of Allah. That means Allah is not absent in the creation. That is a key point. And I would say, let's take something very abstract. Very abstract. Let's say if I'm a mathematician and I'm doing pure math, and in my resolution of trying to understand a concept in pure math, which is totally guided by mathematical abstraction, and I'm doing pure math. That's why it's called pure math. That I can't even at the moment conceive much of its application. Then, is this a creation of Allah? Yes, it is, because you are using your mind that is a creation of Allah, and when you are exercising your thinking, now this is very important, when you are exercising your thinking, in other words, when you are exercising your inquiry from the mind, you are seeking information, knowledge, guidance from the source of that intellect. And as a result of that inquiry, because remember, let me give it a connecting point. It's not just frivolous thinking, okay? There is such thing as useless thinking too. There is thinking that you can do that can corrupt the mind, that can pollute the mind, thinking that you can do that can misguide yourself, because it is thinking that comes from the nafs, from the lower passions, and it can misdirect you. But there is also higher level thinking, whereby you think about solving a certain problem intellectually, a problem that you are trying to solve through consultation, through dialogue, for example. You consult others in a problem. You are doing thinking. You are formulating the problem. You are seeking to find out how you can come to a solution. The thinking process is on. The act of that thinking, even in an abstract problem like mathematics, can trigger that spiritual, rather intellectual intuition to bring you a certain solution. And in fact, many scientific problems were the result of that kind of intellectual intuition that came into manifestation, and which in certain fields of study we call that synchronicity. And it's an amazing area to study, but to put it very simply, it's sometime when they say you get the aha moment, and it was everything that you did in terms of information, seeking, thinking, searching, and then you said to yourself, okay, well, what do I do with it now? And all of a sudden, aha, you get that burst that comes into you, that inspiration, so to speak, that spiritual intuition, spiritual intellect kicks in, and it gives you the answer. And you evolve and develop into that answer, and it was the answer. There are hundreds of examples like this in science. Next question or observation. I think we can take maybe one more, and then inshallah bring the...
How does your karma affect your spiritual upliftment?
Karmas can definitely affect everything that you do, because to simply say, karma is the record or the repository of all your actions and reactions, all your deeds, good, bad and ugly deeds that you do. So the word karma simply means action, but it also means a repository. It means the storehouse of all your good, bad and ugly actions. So ask yourself first that question. Where are all my good, bad and ugly actions? Forget about another life, because sometimes people think it's controversial. There's no controversy, but just leave that aside. Think about this life. So in this life, whatever age that you are, let's take an adult age, right? And in that adult age, whether you are 15, whether you are 25, 35, 45, 55, 105, are you exempt from good, bad and ugly actions? No, you're not exempt. You are not exempt. Every action has a reaction. That is a divine law. So we are guided by our beloved Imam to follow the ethics of our faith. And what that ethics allows us to do, even intellectually, which is the proper behavior in society. And having said that, we need to be honest, sincere, and we need to be following and be where the Imam is in guiding us. Following the path the Imam has shown us, being in the Sirat al-Mustaqim, is the only guarantee, and let me re-emphasize the word only in capital only. It's the only guarantee that your karmas will be good and lead you to salvation. Otherwise, all other karmas you generate, you will have to bear the circumstances of it. And being in Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is what Mawla Bapa tells us all the time, means follow the holy farmans of the Imam. Wherever Mawla Bapa is the Sirat al-Mustaqim. Don't go away from it, don't deviate from it, and stay with it, stay close with the Imam, and let your life be guided by that path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Then you will see even your negative karmas fall away. They will go away. And only the good will remain to allow you to move into Sirat al-Mustaqim and gain that light and gain that success and gain that knowledge. That's what Sirat al-Mustaqim does in a material, spiritual world. Can we make this our last question, Lakshmi? In a simple, straightforward lecture, we can hopefully contextualize this concept of the faith of our forefathers and how, inshallah, hopefully, with Mawla's blessing, that I can articulate it in a way that is relevant to us today.
Thank you very much.
And inshallah, we will see you by next Monday.
Inshallah.
In a follow-up session. Thank you, and prayers are more for you and all the co-hosts, Lakshmi.
Ameen.
Bless you for your seva, for your facilitation, all the hosts and co-hosts.
Ameen.
And Allah bless you with the fulfillment of all your wishes.
Ameen.
Allah accept your seva and your prayers.
Ameen.
And thank you for this opportunity.
Is some of the co-hosts still on?
A youngster asked me this question. He said, when Mawla Bapa says, when you in trouble, take a tasbih, does he mean real, literal tasbih or just, what he says is that if I'm sitting in a train and if I take a tasbih out, people will look at me with suspicious eyes. Do I have to have a tasbih in my hand? Literally when Mawla Bapa says that.
Well, the thing is this. In one place, Mawla Bapa said, the tasbih will remind you. The tasbih will remind you. So if you carry a physical tasbih with you, and yes, I understand that sometimes we may be embarrassed to take our tasbih because we are in the midst of other people. But the tasbih will remind you, you don't have to take your tasbih physically out. To carry a tasbih is nice because it will remind you, because the Imam is asking us to make sure that other things don't blur our understanding and memory. But when you touch your tasbih in your pocket, it will remind you. And then you can say your tasbih in your heart, in your mind.
That's what I told him.
Yeah.
But he said he was confused when Imam said, carry a tasbih in your pocket. But then you said it is to remind you, but you don't have to literally take it out.
No, you don't have to take it out.
Thank you, sir.
Are we going to a collective soul, all of us, whether, white, yellow, blue? And are we entering another dimension because of this situation?
What was the first part of your question? Are we entering what a collective?
Are we all becoming one collective soul during this epidemic?
I'm not exactly sure how you mean by one collective soul. I mean, one thing is for sure, we are all individuals into this epidemic, this pandemic. We are individuals, but are we a collective soul? Can you explain that?
I think what I'm trying to get at as far as soul is concerned, are we all having the thoughts of enlightenment, support of God, along that side, you know, something to help us to have our soul grow?
I think the only way I can respond to this, to my humble understanding, is our beloved Imam during this pandemic in a number of times have said that we need to be a united Jamaat. We are one Jamaat. And he's counting on that perspective, on that action, that we be a united Jamaat in every way and continue to be so. If we are to be a united Jamaat and continue to be so, as it is the desire of our beloved Imam, then I can extend my understanding by saying, in that sense, we can only be united collectively as one soul, if you like, and you can say, perhaps for lack of a better term, collective soul. Yes. So in that sense, we are being that way, and even without the pandemic, it's still a principle of our faith. But as Imam has asked us that we must remain a united Jamaat under this time to help each other and to make sure that we are able to come out of it in the way that it is meant to be.
Okay. And then in Bandi, when we're all sitting and doing Bandi and going Khana in that time, at any of that moment, are we at all one soul? I'm just trying to figure out, either even in our daily life, do we ever become one soul or something like one unit?
No.
Oh, we don't. Okay.
No.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Hassan, there's somebody by the name of S.E. with their hand up.
Okay.
S.E., do you have a question for Dr. Hassan?
I have a feeling that dreams are giving messages, but I can't seem to understand them as far as what they're trying to do.
You said dreams are giving messages?
Yes, I get the feeling that I'm getting messages from my dreams, but I can't seem to I can't seem to understand as to what kind of messages these are.
Yes. Look, interpretation of dreams is a very tricky business. And it's tricky because dreams are generated by various triggers. And when you are into your dream state, as I mentioned in my lecture on From Duality to Unity, that you enter, if you like, the second phase of your sleep cycle. So from waking, you go to your dream state, which is sort of the second state. And in that state, you're actually probing your subconscious mind. And in probing your subconscious mind, it's a violent sea of emotion and uncontrolled volition. And therefore, you are really into a sea of emotions. And these are your emotions, these are your everything of your being. And when they surface at the level of your mind, which is what you remember as part of your dreams, they're trying to analyze and say, what was this dream about? And when you say, what was the dream about, you are trying to find meaning. Are the dreams giving me meaning? It may well be the dreams are giving you meaning, and the only way I can ask you to look into it is this. Now, there are various methods and techniques related to how people are keeping a dream diary, and, there are certain type of dreams that are very unique that comes from an individual. But most dreams are a function of what we do in our subconscious, meaning when our awareness shifts from the physical, from the waking consciousness, you go to the sleep state, which is your second state, your dream state. Into that dream state, your awareness is in your subconscious, And your subconscious now is witnessing, in your subconscious, you are now witnessing your emotions, and you are witnessing the storehouse of all other activities that are stored there from before or from within this life or the last 24 hours or whatever. And you are subject to an uncontrolled reaction to what's happening to you. And
But I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. HASSAM, but these dreams actually wake me up in a state of in a very emotional state.
Okay.
And I burst into crying.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised. As I mentioned a moment ago, you're into a sea of emotion. Now, all I can tell you is this. The best person to analyze your dream is yourself. And the reason being, only you can find the symbolism behind those emotions that has brought you to that level. What I mean to say is this, that there are things that we do in our daily life. Let me give you a very crystal clear example. For example, there are certain things that we do that are unrealized in our physical conscious mode of existence. In other words, there may be hopes, aspirations, there may be things that we desire to do but haven't done and will not be able to do because there are certain limitations, there are certain obstacles. There may be emotional issues we were not able to deal with during our waking life because they're of personal nature and we don't have the wherewithal to deal with those emotions. That's why people go for, emotional health counseling and so on. But the point is, all of those activities basically eventually get stored into that part of your being called your subconscious. And when you go to sleep, your awareness is now reactivating all those unfulfilled activities in the sense of a dream. You look at it as a dream, but they are the unfulfilled memories of what happened to you in the waking life. And that surface to you as a dream. And
so would they be only in this life or the life before?
No, for some people, definitely it may well be matters and issues that are ripe enough to now come at the surface of your subconscious and manifest themselves, and they could be from previous lives. And we have, there is a lot of evidence to indicate that that could be a possibility. But by and large, most of them have to do with this life. Anything to do with previous life requires a different form of interaction.
Okay, all right.
Perhaps when we have the larger Q&A session, you may wish to think what I told you, and then perhaps repose your question then.
Okay, thank you, Dr. HASSAM.
You're welcome.
God bless.
Oh, by the way, if I can just add one point of note there.
Yes.
That in the case that when some emotional aspect like these surfaces to us and you wake up with them, you said, I say to you is, an important part is to reframe your sleep pattern, and that is by, you decide, I can't prescribe it for you, but you have to decide, for example, do something of a spiritual activity. Read something about our faith, read Farman, listen to a Ginan, do some prayers and tasbih, which I'm sure you may be doing. And in other words, 10 or 15 minutes before you go to sleep, engage yourself into some spiritual activity so that you are repatterning your mind and you are basically ending up with that dynamics while you go to sleep. It takes a little bit of time when you do that, but after a few days, you may find there is an enormous pleasure in doing that, and your sleep will be much more peaceful and much more restful.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hasham.
You're welcome.
Mola bless.
Amen. Shall we close the meeting, Faiza?
I think so. I think that's all the hands raised. So I think we can call it a night.
All right. Once again,
Thank
Mola
you
bless
very
everyone,
much.
and inshallah see you next Monday, or for those who can, tomorrow Tuesday for my other lecture. Thank you, Faiza, for facilitating as a host. Allah bless you with, for your time and your dedication, and to every participant. Yali Madad and Mola bless you.
Yali Madad.
Yali Madad.
Yali Madad.